Manager at Fidelis Cybersecurity, and I'm here to talk about exploiting redundancy properties in malicious infrastructure. So brief introduction, I do work for a security company, Fidelis. I also teach at the University of Illinois, a hands-on security course. I run several private groups for threat intelligence sharing and some targeted operations against various malware families. Professionally, I generally focus only on criminal threats, not espionage or APT stuff. So that does color a little bit of what I do. So here's kind of just a brief highlight of what we're going to talk about today, talking about single point of failure versus redundancy, and then going down of various different ways that you can exploit redundancy to either affect malicious networks, detect them, detect unknown threats, and going on to surveillance and more effective takedowns. So what I mean by redundancy, right, is a similar thing in IT infrastructure of not having single points of failure. There are many malware families and malware campaigns that use a single method of communication, a given IP address, a static host name, something along those lines. So the state of C2 is either up or down, right? There's no ambiguity or things there. It's very easy to set up, low cost to maintain, right? Entry-level adversaries tend to do this because they don't have a lot of time or experience in setting up C2s correctly. They just want to make money quickly or commit crimes quickly. You know, the downside is if there's any kind of disruption, right, it's the network, the C2 is either up or down. So, you know, if there's a malicious host name at no IP suspends it, well, the adversary is completely out of luck. Their victims are unavailable to them, right? Though the one thing I want to emphasize throughout this talk, right, is the idea that a single data point, you can't establish a pattern based on that, right? You know, there's no line, there's nothing to correlate to something else. So if somebody's using a host name, right, there's no way to create a pattern out of that behavior. You need multiple data points, right? So the creation of that pattern is creation of patterns is what we'll talk about as we go on and what we're exploiting, right? The longer an attacker, right, you know, is in the game committing criminal activity, the more likely they are to enhance their operations to persist over the long term, right? You know, most attackers want to keep committing crimes. They're not just in it to hit something and go away, right? As a counterpoint, espionage, APT type actors, they're more likely to have their C2s only open or up for small periods of time when they're operational. Criminal actors tend to want to be up persistently and over the long term, right? So as an example of C2 configuration, and this is an example for a system I'll talk about a little bit more as we go on in Barncat. I'm not sure that this is as easily viewed by everybody in the audience, but basically this little JSON blob is a configuration for Dark Comet, and there's only one C2 in this right here. It's this IP address. So if that IP is taken down, right, this malware campaign is over. You know, Dark Comet also has the ability to have multiple C2s, so in this case you're seeing several, they're all no IP, but I think in this one it was like 12 different host names of Crazy Monkey 1, Crazy Monkey 2, up to like 12 at no IP. So all of those can point to different places. You know, so if one were taken down or the computer behind one were taken down, they can simply just reassert control other ways. There's several different techniques that malware authors and adversaries use to establish redundancy, right? And none of this should be particularly new, right? The first, right, is just multiple host names or IP addresses in a static list, what you saw on the previous slide, right? You know, very rudimentary, right? There's the use of fast flux or double flux networks, domain generation algorithms, Tor, and the various anonymization protocols. Many will do multiple different methods, right? So it was in some banking families, banking malware families, you'll see the use of some static lists, DGAs, and Tor as a third level fallback, right? Ideally, if the adversary is doing this right, all of this will point to different places. So on that previous slide, all the host names pointed to no IP. So I can go to no IP and just suspend all of that wholesale, and then the actor is down. More sophisticated adversaries will have IP addresses sitting in multiple hosting providers in multiple jurisdictions in multiple countries, so that it's more difficult, though not impossible, to take all of their infrastructure down. And it's just a way of making life more difficult for us. Okay? So one of the first things you can do with redundancy is it creates some possibilities to increase detection of unknown stuff. For a static indicator, a host name, or an IP address, you have to know that it's malicious. Otherwise, you just have no information. But in redundancy properties, you have patterns that you can look for, and we'll talk about a couple of those, right? So it helps you spot unknown threats in, like, for instance, domain generation algorithms. Often, it's not normal user behavior to attempt to resolve 1,000 domains that look randomly generated, very quickly, right? It's pathological behavior. You might not know anything about underlying what's going on, but a machine shouldn't do that, and it gives you something to look for. So the idea, behind this is trying to either, one, force an adversary to adopt some redundancy stuff so you have things to look for, or simply just abusing or using the fact that they're doing redundancy to find the patterns of behavior so you can do data mining and statistical analysis, right? The reason of doing that, right, as I focus on criminal threats, I tend to like doing prosecutions if I can get law enforcement to be helpful on things. And the key to every successful criminal prosecution, even in normal crimes, but very much true for computer crimes, is finding a pattern of what somebody's done over the long term to find the one time that they screwed up, right? So, and that, like I said, at that point lets you attribute who they are and get a successful prosecution, okay? Now, that being said, and I will do takedowns that aren't law enforcement related, but there is some risk there, right? If there's a static indicator of an IP address, that's easy to take down for most hosting providers anyway. Say, hey, this is a malicious IP used only for criminal purposes. Here's all the data. A hosting provider will often take that offline, right? There is some transitory impact, but an adversary will often just say, okay, well, I'm just going to get another virtual private server on another hosting provider. They've got a backup of their data, and they're up and running in hours, if not days. So the impact is very short-lived. The other problem is that once that happens, then you usually lose visibility into what they're doing, and you have to redo all your research again, right? However, if there's patterns that you can observe, usually those patterns exist over the long term. So even if they move their infrastructure around, if you know what the patterns to look for, you're able to still maintain surveillance as they change and adapt, right? So as an example of detection, right, in double flux or fast flux and double flux networks, very generally easy to spot, relies on, multiple A records for the same host name that point to IP addresses in very divergent areas with short time to live. In this case, 1,800 seconds and only 5 IP addresses. But if you resolve that repeatedly over the course of 30 minutes, once those TTLs expire, you'll see other IP addresses that get cycled in and cycled out. So it's common to have hundreds or thousands of IP addresses for a single DNS indicator. So the idea is, right, for the attacker, is that if I take down any of those IP addresses, well, the time to live expires 30 minutes later, and then they just cycle in new IP addresses. So they maintain control that way. However, there's a definite pattern here, right? Or it's common for fast flux networks to have specifically 5 IP addresses for a given host name, generally in consumer IP space with short time to live. So you can programmatically say, you know what, I'm resolving something, or one of my constituent computers is resolving something. This is what comes back. I may not know anything about what dive with sharks is, but I know that that's pathological behavior, and say, I have a machine that I need to take a look at. Okay? The only real use case for doing behavior like this is content delivery networks. There's a finite number of those that you would have to whitelist. But that said, very few people will have name server records with short time to lives. For A records, it's very useful for content delivery networks, Cloudflare, DDoS providers, and the like. But there's not really so much of a use case to do that for name servers, right? So again, seeing that pattern of how fast flux networks work, right? You can combine it with some other things, domain or IP reputation, and say, you know what, this is maliciousness. I don't know anything about it, but I know that there's something malicious going on, to go find unknown threats programmatically. The second example is domain generation algorithms, right, which is a big area of my research. DGAs, basically random generated host names or domains, usually hundreds or thousands, sometimes done on a daily basis. Attackers will only register a couple of these, and many will be unregistered, right? So they only need to control one of those domains, so that if I take down a given domain based on a complaint to a registrar, they register another domain, they're still in business, right? So it's an idea of them keeping some resiliency, right? But again, it forces them, or by its very nature, forces them to create a pattern of behavior that you can look at. So this is an example of 5 domains as part of TINBA, or a tiny banker, right? So if you know about the DGAs, right, you can load that into DNS response policy zone and just prevent resolutions, right? That's very easy, but you have to know about it first. The other thing that this does is make it easy to find otherwise unknown domain generation algorithms. As I said, it's not very common for a machine to resolve lots of domains quickly, and it's certainly not common for a machine to resolve lots of domains and get NX domain, which is basically, record not found response code DNS. So, on the previous slide, right, you see 5 tiny banker domains, but there's thousands that are otherwise unregistered. So what the most common response to a machine that's got malware that's enabled with a DGA is you're going to see tons of NX domain or response not found records. You don't know anything about it, but that's pathological behavior. Even for machines that resolve DNS requests quickly, the typical response is that they resolve. There's something in there configured it. A lot of NX domains is something pathological, and it gives you a pattern to look for. You can look in DNS logs for that repetitive queries. And also, there are many security companies that do sinkholes. We'll talk about that in a couple of slides. But if you know what sinkhole IP addresses are out there on the internet, it's a finite list, then anything that resolves to those IP addresses, even though that's a security researcher doing sinkholing, well, it's not normal PC behavior to beacon out to a sinkhole. Something is infected with something. And you might not know anything about, except they're reaching out to a sinkhole. So it's a very good thing to detect on, for incident response, or at least incident detection. Okay. Some other things that you can do, right, for DGAs is looking for, high entropy domain names. Every language has a certain statistical pattern of the letters that are commonly used, right? In English, right, T is one of the most common. T and S and E are common letters, right? Q is not a common letter. When using random formulas, however, if you did a histogram of the use of various letters, right, it would be flat. The letters are all equally statistically occurring, right? So that it's not human language that's creating it. You might not know anything else about it, but it's pathological, right? You can also do things like n-gram analysis of taking character combinations and then looking to statistical patterns, in domain names versus what would normally occur in natural human languages, right? So you're looking for sequences of letters, that are otherwise not common, and that would indicate, not necessarily prove, the presence of a DGA. So again, using this pattern of behavior of a machine to say, hey, I don't know anything about what's going on, I just know this is not normal. So, for the English language, right, TH, that letter combination is very common in English, right? But TQ is not common at all, right? So if I see something with uncommon letter combinations, right, I can create some weighting algorithm and scoring and say, this is not normally naturally occurring in language, that there's something else there. As long as you've got domains of sufficient length, you don't have to deal with problems of like acronyms, right? A 20-character domain name will often be based on whatever words are common in a given language, right? Some care needs to be done is that the statistical likelihood of various letter combinations varies between language. So it's common to, if you're using a data set of doing n-gram analysis based on just English words, you may have false positives on Chinese or Russian or other domains that have different letter frequencies, right? But it gives you a good tool to start detecting, those unknown threats, right? It's not 100%, right? But it gives you some pattern with which to find the signal in the noise, right? And there's a good paper out there, the use of n-gram models for DGA detection, that was written by Fyodor Yuronchkin. Hopefully I'm pronouncing that right. And once that's published, that'd be a good thing to take a look at. The other thing you do once, like I said, you've established patterns, right, is then you can kind of do things that are more, proactive on adversaries. So there is the use of sinkholing. For DGAs, this is a very easy thing to do because, as I said, most domains in a DGA are unregistered, which means I don't require any special legal sanction. I don't need to get court orders or anything like that. I just can go to GoDaddy or whoever and register a domain, and then victims start contacting me, right? And I can get some information. So all it takes is registration, right? Very useful for getting telemetry data, right? At that point I start getting, relatively high reliability data on how many victims and where those victims are located. I'll see their IP addresses, so it's very useful in talking to law enforcement saying, hey, you know what, there's 1,000 infected machines in Brussels, Belgium, you should take care of that problem, right? That being said, there are some adversaries who create sinkhole-aware malware. It's not terribly common, and the sinkhole detection is rudimentary, but it does exist out there because the adversary knows their IP addresses. If they see other IP addresses resolving to their DGA, then they know somebody is paying attention to them. Okay? There are some other uses, of sinkholing, however, right? You can, to an extent, control the victim if you wanted to, right? So, the first use case of sinkholing is just seeing the patterns of network behavior, and you can write network detection rules based on that. But you can also control victim endpoints, right? Now, some require encryption keys that you may have. There's proprietary protocols and the like, so there's other steps you have to go through, right, to mimic the C2 protocol. Now, things you could do here is that many botnets, for instance, not all of them, but many have, a kind of self-removal command that you can send to victims and say, you know what, I want to uninstall for whatever reason. So if I were a researcher, I could simply basically take down a botnet by forcing all of the infected machines to uninstall themselves, right? You can also push software down, right? Which we'll talk about in the next slide. But this self-destruction thing has often been part of takedowns in the past, where it's an option to clean up machines, after one of these activities. Okay? The second part of pushing software down to the end victims. This has happened, I think, twice so far this year, where somebody has gotten a foothold in malicious infrastructure, and then instead of having it push, ransomware or whatever it was designed to push, they pushed a Avira antivirus. I believe it was Avira that they used, so that the victims go out and say, hey, give me my malware, and they get antivirus delivered, as a response to that, right? Transient impact, right? Because the attacker catches on to that relatively quickly. But also all attackers generally make sure their malware's antivirus is fully undetectable in AV anyway. So pushing things like Avira don't matter, right? If I were in this business, I'd be pushing updates to Flash or Java or whatever to actually harden machines instead of pushing just AV, right? That would give you a little bit more persistent benefit, right? But the important note of this, right, is that if you're controlling victim machines, I can't think of a jurisdiction where that's legal, right? That is criminal behavior, right? There are people who have done it, right? But that would, like I said, that's prosecutable behavior. So I wouldn't recommend that as a course of action of patching a bunch of machines on the internet you don't control. But it is something that can be done, and in some countries you can get legal sanction to do that kind of activity, right? So another thing, that you can do, right, is once you kind of establish some of those patterns, is do what I like to call targeted intelligence operations. Very often in computer crime, right? Computer crime knows no political boundaries. I can infect machines and get victims all over the world, without any respect to what the laws or a political situation of whatever country that I'm in, right? It makes it very difficult to get information, right? Because, once you start dealing with national boundaries, foreign policy considerations come into play. So it is very difficult for the United States government to get legal process to get a wiretap on a machine in Russia, and vice versa, right? That's just the nature of the beast, right? So doing targeted intelligence operations, right, is doing subtle ways to get information, usually when more direct and legal means aren't really available, right? So the other aspect of this, right, is even if there are legal means available, there is a lot of privacy protections that are available, for in our internet-connected world. Kind of as a consequence for the amount of data that's just generated every day for people who use, social media or Gmail, or taking pictures, the metadata just in pictures from your phone. There's tons of data there, right? There's been an explosion of privacy technologies that, even given legal sanction, right, it makes difficult to get some information. So there is a place of doing some intelligence collection where legal means aren't available to you, right? So when you have just a single IP address or a host name, your ability to do anything is somewhat limited, right? You can get it taken down or suspended, whatever, right? And then it's just down. There's no more data collection really that can be done, or you can get a wiretap, right, or of whatever jurisdiction you happen to be in, right? But you don't really have any other tracking ability or any easy way to do manipulation, right? And doing some of these things, right, if take it down, right, you may break your visibility, and that's bad, right? However, when an attacker uses redundant command and control things, you've got subtle ways where you don't take down everything, but you can manipulate part of it just to figure out how they react, or force them to follow a line that you want them to go down, right? So for DGAs, for example, I can take down a domain and not all of the domains, or not suspend the entire list of domains that it would generate, just to see how they change registrant details over time, or if they're changing payment methods or the like, right? So the key to doing this kind of thing, right, is to have enough impact where they notice, but not enough impact where they just disappear and stop operating, right? It is possible to do something kind of overtly destructive to their operations, where they just tear everything down and start over, and then break your visibility. The key is doing something just enough to get them to make decisions that aren't in their benefit. We'll do a couple of examples, right? So the first, is during CryptoLocker, which was active from 2013 to 2014. For a period of time, their registrar they were using was a company called DNSPod, right? And that's all that they used for their domain registrants. Also, that registrar happens to be fairly popular for Chinese APT actors, but it's a Chinese company, so that probably doesn't mean much, right? At this point, China and America, as countries, weren't overly cooperative, right? Now what my government does and what I do aren't the same thing, right? Because as a private sector actor, I'm not bound by foreign policy considerations. So what I wanted to do is build some relationships with organizations inside of China to work on issues and solve mutual problems of a criminal nature, right? Because crime is crime is crime. There's a victim, and we can work through those problems, right? But I also wanted to see that if I started taking down their domains, if they would go to another registrar, how they would react, and get them to use increased, more payment methods that we might be able to get some intelligence out of. So built a relationship with DNSPod and then started suspending their domains as I observed them, right? So for a couple of days this happened, they didn't do much. and then they moved to another registrar. After about a week of doing this every day, then they hopped to a different registrar. It was GoDaddy for a little while, right? But about 2 weeks to a month later, then they hopped back to DNS Pod. They didn't really care that much that it happened. It was just kind of the cost of doing business for them. But that said, them having to cycle their accounts for domain registration using a different registrar allowed for different lead generation opportunities for law enforcement that were available to Western governments. At this point, with CryptoLocker anyway, there wasn't any cooperation with Russian or Chinese law enforcement. It was just private sector and Western law enforcement, right? So it was able to force the attacker to make changes to their behavior that led to ultimately attributing the individual behind that, right? And it opened the door of private sector cooperation between organizations in those countries, right? A second example is there was another criminal actor I was tracking, more of a service provider than a malware adversary, but they had all of their stuff that operated their service on a shared hosting provider, right? So that it was there, and it was a shared hosting provider, gave me the opportunity to simply just say, hey, hosting provider, I want an account on that same machine. And if you've ever been on a shared hosting provider, Linux box, permissions are often insecure. You get all sorts of information in subtle ways that wouldn't alert the adversary if that were true. In this case, the hosting provider did have some hardening in place, so I really wasn't able to gather what I wanted to do, but the adversary didn't know that, right? So at a certain point, I said, this particular adversary knew who I was and that I was actively looking at them. So I was able to say, all right, I got an account on that machine. I said, hey, by the way, very subtly communicated to him, by the way, I have an account on the same machine you're running things on, right? Which got him to move his stuff to a dedicated box, right? It had no particular impact to me that he was on a dedicated versus shared because the collection I was doing wasn't successful anyway. But him moving and using that move function that's often in like cPanel or hosting provider accounts, they often do not delete the data behind them. So he moved all of his operations to another server, left all the data behind, which meant legal process was available to get that in a non-obtrusive way. Whenever a search warrant is served on a hosting provider and you've got a dedicated box, right, they're turning the box off, they're imaging the drives. It is very obtrusive. The adversary knows that their box is being searched. In this case, he just left all the data behind, moved his operations so that when that box was searched, the adversary was none the wiser and got all sorts of great information out of that, his home IP address, IP addresses of other associates, usernames, passwords, Bitcoin wallets. It was a lot of data that was left on that machine that doing this allowed us to collect a lot of intelligence in a non-obtrusive way. Okay? With redundancy, also kind of comes more fingerprints and things that you can look for, right? And more importantly, not just for identifying otherwise unknown infected machines or unknown malware, but these fingerprints will help identify who the adversary is, right? And using the example of DGAs, where you have lots of domain registrations going on, right? There's a lot of registrant details that happen to be created along the way that allows for finding and tracking, a specific individual throughout all of the operations that go down, right? I may not be able to take some of these details and say, I know it's this person in this country who lives at this address, but I could see everything associated with them and correlate domains to the same actor with it. So we'll talk about that a little bit for just who is information, right? For whatever particular reason, some top-level domains don't have who is protection, but a lot of adversaries don't use who is protection for whatever reason, right? So as an example, right, the name of David Bowers and this email address behind us is what was used until several months ago anyway for BDEP, which is a click fraud based malware. But all the domain registration details all had that name, all had that email address for BDEP. So there's a very clear pattern of behavior that you could look at, right? So, so going from there, right, I know that this person is using this very specific name and very specific email addresses. I'd like to see what else is associated with this person, right? There's a service called Domain Tools. I highly recommend it, right? I have no professional affiliation with them. I just use their product. But it's possible to simply search on a name or an email address and then correlate all of those domains into one list, right? So from just the observation of the redundancy they had in BDEP, I was able to get the WHOIS registration details, which are consistent of David Bowers, pump that into Domain Tools, and then I see domains that are also associated with Neckers and Angler in that list. So now I'm identifying this particular actor is involved with now several other different campaigns, and the unifying link is the fingerprints they're creating with redundancy, right? And last, with Domain Tools, you can also create a registrant alert. So anytime this person registers a domain, within the next day, I'll get an email that says, here's all the domains this person's registered. So it gives me kind of enhanced intelligence collection I can do on that. Probably not the most visible slide, but in here you'll see 24 some odd domains of the several thousand that were registered to David Bowers, right? And you see a variety of different things in here. Some are very clearly DGA oriented. Up to the top, we see these kind of random sequences of characters. The fourth from the bottom says ace-nate-raid, which is a word list based DGA. The one above that says accident-muscle, right? So word list random generation stuff, but gives you a lot of information, right, that allows you to correlate things and say, okay, I know this individual's involved in this, and now I was able to track him to other campaigns, right? And this is an example of a registrant alert email, for David Bowers and Gennady Borisov. Both are used by the same person. Registered this one day. CarolinaUpstateProperties.com, which is Angler off the top of my head, but I could be wrong, right? So it gives you a lot of information that you could work with. As an example number 2, the use of SSL in encryption, right, is, encryption's a good thing, also has some consequences of, if it's done right, the inability to see what's going on in an encrypted session, right, provides some advantages to people who engage in crime, However, right, with the use of a certificate, right, there are details in that certificate, right? For a single machine, I can't give you a pattern of behavior. Is this certificate one use, or is there a common private key that they're using? Are the details, reused, or is it generated new each time, right? For multiple C2s, I could take a look and say, all right, you know what, I see 3 C2s here. All of them are using the same cert despite being different IP addresses. Now I've got patterns to look at just within SSL, right? There is some malware that does certificate pinning, which makes sure that the victim verifies that they are being presented the right digital certificate before it communicates to a C2 to prevent SSL man-in-the-middle web proxy type of behavior. So there's some of that going on, but with that certificate pinning, right, that binds them to use a specific cert even if they're moving IP addresses. So it really, while it gives them the benefit of having the use of encryption in ways that are difficult to intercept, it ties them to a specific digital cert, specific details, and that pattern, allows you to start programmatically hunting and looking for other things. So in this particular example, this is used in Android malware, but it's very consistent. It's always the same number, or always the same certificate, despite being, every time a new Android malware was generated with this tool, it would still use the same digital certificate. So I was able to go to the Google Play Store and say, hey, I want to see any presence of that SSL serial number or that issuer information, which, there at one point in time was a Cincinnati in the state of Oregon, but Oregon is not in the European Union, right? There would be Oregon, United States. So obviously, made up certificate details also, but able to, one, if you're looking for just the presence of network SSL, right? You can use Shodan or other tools to simply find where this stuff is. You may have no other observable data point, but you can scan the entire internet for a given certificate serial number, right? You know, for signing certs, right? For Android malware or others, right? You can hunt application stores to find malware created by this tool, even though you don't have an observable event. So in that previous example with that certificate, I used that to find the use of malware using this builder in the Google Play Store that was otherwise, before then, unknown to Google. So found many applications that were available for download, you know, verified by Google, so you didn't have to go do the install apps from untrusted sources, settings. This is something that people could get malware on phones immediately and directly, right? So gave the ability to find that stuff in the Play Store. Some other things that redundancy provides you some ability to do is surveillance, right? With a static indicator, right? I mean, yeah, you can surveil it, but it's either up or down. There's no changes to keep track of, right? You know, that being said, DNS data can change, right? If you control a DNS server, you can move IP addresses at will at any time you really want to, right? You know, IP addresses also can come and go because boxes get suspended or use of compromised domains or whatever it is, right? So either with DGAs, you know, or with malware configs, can use ADNS tools, asynchronous DNS, to just bulk resolve this stuff, you know, every hour or 30 minutes, and then just look for changes, right? Just based on DNS resolutions, right? Which is essentially what my DGA feeds that we'll talk about a little bit later do. Is just all it does is take lists of malicious domains in a DGA, resolve them all, and then just figure out what's listening and what's not. And as the changes are made, give some notifications, right? So, like I said, C2s can start, stop at any time. You know, they can stop issuing instructions at any time. So keeping surveillance up to see how these things change over time is important, right? And those changes, and certainly like the related metadata, you know, is very important in an investigation, right? There are several malware adversaries who will have their C2s resolve only for 15 or 30 minutes while they're operational, and they'll point to private IP address space or just not resolve at all when they aren't actively in operation, right? So the ability of seeing that stuff is also important. Okay? Now that said, you know, bulk resolving domains, you know, is creation of feeds, right? You know, and doing that intake is still more or less a passive tactic, right? You know, it's not useless, right? It has its uses, you know, but, you know, it's still, you know, you pump it into a firewall, you do something on it, but it's retroactive, or you know. However, doing this bulk resolution on a frequent basis, right? You can start seeing the C2 changes in real time, and that's the interesting stuff, and then do notifications, which I'll show in a slide here. Right, I use a little app called Pushover, which is just essentially a push app available for Apple and Android phones with a simple API that I dump anytime a new domain in a DGA shows up. I push a notification to my phone with some details, which is what you see behind me, right? So this is an example of 3 MATSNU domains. MATSNU is a word list EGA. And that gives me several pieces of information, right? You know, the IP addresses it points to, what name servers it's using, and what the name server IPs are using and what registrar. The 2 on the left are actual valid MATSNU. The third one on the right, organization.com, is a collision with a real domain. MATSNU being word list, a word list DGA. Eventually collides with actual real domains because it's based off of real words. But just looking at the data on those first 2 on the left there, I see the name servers of jmanage.com and thefancastar.com, right, which are dedicated name servers, or at least they were at the time, dedicated name servers to MATSNU. So very quickly able to say, you know what, the 2 on the left are valid, the one on the right is a false positive, you know, and clean up data proactively, right? Also provides some ability of saying, hey, you know, this is something I'm investigating. You know, hey, FBI or whatever law enforcement body, I'm now seeing this malicious domain resolve to a US IP address. why don't we go ahead and take action on that box in very quick turnaround, right? You know, within an hour, I'll see a notification of something that comes live, and then we can act on it fairly quickly, and engage the legal process. So it provides a lot of ability for quick turnaround. So very easy API. All you got to do is pass it an application key, a user key, and then whatever message, and then just pump it out, right? So very easy to do that kind of stuff. Okay. Also, right, what you could do with some of these redundancy properties is start pairing it with other data and other data sets, right? So early on, there were slides of malware configuration. Internally, we call that system Barncat, where it just does a lot of static config extraction from malware. And it does this kind of on a bulk scale. The system has almost 100,000 malware configs in there. But it also has a lot of metadata that would otherwise be unavailable with just sandboxing. So settings like campaign ID, mutex, file paths, C2 information, all of that stuff can also be correlated with other things to start seeing patterns of behavior. And that's kind of a talk in its own right. But for instance, campaign ID, many, though not all, malware families have free-form text fields where somebody can just name their malware campaign whatever they want. And it's very difficult when you're putting something in a free-form text field not to put something of yourself in there that would otherwise help me figure out who you are. Okay. So ultimately, right, the goal is to be to have more effective disruption of adversaries, right? So the kind of the takedown business of taking down a domain or an IP address or whatever has some transient impact, right? But the attacker can change and then otherwise be invisible to us, right? However, if there's patterns and redundancy, right, they're having to do the same thing over and over again, right? They're registering lots of domains, or different services or whatever. They're doing it on a repetitive basis because by the nature of redundancy, they have to do that, right? In context of an investigation, right? As the good guys, right? People in law enforcement and prosecution really only have to be lucky one time to be able to attribute who an actor is. We just have to find the one time that they screwed up, right? And almost always there is that over the long term. So having the ability to track an adversary, know the patterns of the behavior, and then map it back retroactively to see what they've been doing for the last year, 2 years, 3 years, to find that one point where they screwed up, right? The corollary is, the criminal has to be lucky all the time. They have to get, their operational security perfect each and every time that they do something. And over the long term, that's very difficult, right? It's not hard to do it once or twice correctly. But when you're doing it hundreds of times or thousands of times over the course of years, you may not notice, right? You registered a domain and you didn't notice that your VPN client dropped and now you're exposing your private IP address or something along those lines, all right? So the more they have to do, right, the more likely it is they are to make mistakes, which goes into why the targeted intelligence operations are so valuable. You're provoking them to make changes to hopefully make an operational security screw up that allows attribution, right? So, like I said, all successful criminal prosecutions, right, involve that monitoring, right, and getting a good view of everything that they're up to, and then finding the time that they screwed up to identify who they are, right? So exploiting redundancy, right, provides some of the opportunity to make this happen, right? It's still possible when they do single point of stuff, but the more that they're doing more frequently, right, it increases the odds that they're going to screw up. Okay, so a couple of free resources, right? Last year I talked about my DGA feeds, right? They're still free, there's no authentication. You go to that URL and download that now. For our static malware configs, we have a MISP instance up at barncat.fidelosecurity.com. If you would like access, send me an email. There's about 100,000 malware configs over the past year that we've observed from the sources that we have. Okay. So that's the end of my presentation. Spasiba, and any questions?
Good day. Thanks. First of all, thanks for great presentation. A lot of new things I know. Quick side note: domain tools are great, but recently I find out that they have not full database. Try to Google some emails with registrant, and you will find in other services with more malware domain names. And my question is, do you have some experience to with domain name algorithm with words like words like love, hate, weather, first, and it's randomly generated and registered? Do you have something to deal with it?
The word list-based DGAs, right? There's Matsnu, Rovniks. I want to say there's a third one whose name escapes me, right? Doing the n-gram analysis won't work because they're using real words, right? However, the pattern you still can use is a lot of NX domain requests, right? Or at least Matsnu, I think, only generates 9 a day. So even that, you'd be hard-pressed to detect it. You know, but for Rovniks, I want to say it's several hundred a day. So even though it's wordless-based generation, right, the most common response you're going to get is NX domain, so you can still use that specific pattern to find it.
Where do you get this domain name query? Do you have like name server?
Oh yeah. If you're running for an enterprise who's got their own DNS resolver, or for that matter, if you're just running an IDS, there are signatures in most IDSs to just, assuming it sees the DNS traffic on the wire, it will say that's too many NX domains. So, but yeah, if you have access to your own resolver, you'll see it in the logs, or if you have access to the network traffic.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, thank you. Other questions? No?
John, you've been talking a lot about law enforcement. Could you please comment the situation when, for example, a hacker hacked a poorly protected Wi-Fi network of his neighbor, for example, and committed an attack? So is this neighbor in danger? Should he be afraid of prosecution? Thank you.
Okay. So if I understand the question of somebody kind of maliciously using somebody's home network, there's two schools of thought, right? There's the first, you know, you probably, I should say, for the purposes of like real criminal behavior, right? You know, somebody's going to come in and do an investigation. They'll eventually figure that out. They may search your home in the process. You may have to deal with hassle, but they're going to eventually see an open wireless network and know that you weren't responsible. Now, that being said, at least for copyright infringement in the United States, you know, the various record labels and movie labels really don't care. They'll just sue you anyway because that's the IP address they see software piracy going on. So from that sake, I mean, it'll give you hassle, but really I think you only have to worry about copyright infringement, at least for places reachable by the US record labels and the like, right? The other school of thought is, if I were a criminal, right, I would definitely have my home wireless network be unprotected and open because, well, it's an open wireless network, there's no logs. How do you attribute the network traffic as actually me? So if I were a criminal, I'd have my home network open, wide open all the time, just to make attribution more difficult. Does that answer your question? All right, perfect.
Hi, thanks a lot for your presentation. As per double flux network, how many operators of double flux networks do you know, and what measures do you take to defeat those?
So how many double flux networks there are?
I mean, there are several gangs who operate for fast flux networks. So
Yeah.
are you aware of several of those, or only ones, or you do not differentiate between those? And just how deeply you research double flux networks?
I researched it more deeply kind of years ago, and I haven't done much recently in years. I mean, I know there's several, but I don't really discriminate at this point, saying this double flux is this guy or this double flux is that guy. Usually most of them are service providers and they provide to multiple people. So I tend to be more tracking, malware adversaries than service providers. There was a second part of your question. What was?
I'll just ask you another one. And
Okay.
As per DGA, do you defeat DGAs by means of pre-registering those, or you just monitor those and that's all? And if yes, if you do defeat somehow, how do you do the bulk registrations of tons of the domains, something like that?
I do rarely, but I will take out an entire DGA, right, from time to time. First, I want to be sure that it really will be impactful. Many DGAs like Tinba, right, there's just a static seed and they can just turn around and just reship out with another static seed. Or if they're using multiple C2 methods of DGAs and Tor and static lists, I wouldn't do it because they'd simply just reassert control immediately and push a new version, right? But that said, if for CryptoLocker, and for Game Over Zeus, right, with Operation Tovar in 2014, it involved basically the FBI seizing all the domains as property, and then for nick.ru, just having an agreement of them no longer registering those domains or allowing them to be registered, right? I can do bulk registration. There is a registrar with Shadow Server. They have their own registrar for this purpose, where they get heavily discounted, like pennies or free in some case domain registration, but it has to be for security purposes, right? So I would use a registrar like that if I was doing kind of a bulk registration campaign.
So do you have sinkhole infrastructure, and if yes, what technology stack do you use, and if you operate one of those?
I do sinkholing, but I do it on an ad hoc basis. I don't kind of persistently sinkhole things. I just gather some information for whatever purpose I have and then do it down. Software I use, for the most part, it seemed like a disproportionate amount of DGA-based malware that I was sinkholing used HTTP as a protocol, so I just used a web server and then I've got the access logs, right? But for some rats, Dark Comet, I think there's you can put up a fake C2 to get beaconing information, or there was an old port sentry, if you're familiar with that listens on a port only for the purposes of finding people who are scanning. If that's all the information, then I just run port sentry on every port and then just listen to what hits. Okay. I think I may have time for one more question if somebody's interested. All right, thank you.